The small apartment smelled of dust and old memories. It was a scent David had come to associate with his life, a soft, clinging aroma that permeated the worn fabric of the sofa and the peeling paint on the kitchen walls. Sunlight filtered through a grimy window pane struggled to illuminate the room, casting long, tired shadows across the linoleum floor. David stood by the sink, a chipped mug clutched in his hand. The water that flowed from the faucet was a low, sputtering stream, a sound that seemed to mock his own depleted energy. He watched as the mug filled slowly, a mundane task that felt monumental in its quiet despair. Rachel sat on the sofa, a blanket draped over her thin legs. Her head rested against a pillow that had long lost its fluff, her breathing shallow and punctuated by a faint, persistent wheeze. Even in sleep, her body seemed to be at war with itself. David's gaze lingered on her, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. He saw not just the illness that had stolen her strength, but the vibrant, laughing woman she used to be. The memory of her running on the beach, her hair flying in the wind, was a beautiful torment. It was a life they had once had, a life he had vowed to reclaim. He carried the mug of water to her and placed it on the small side table. The soft buzz of the lamp beside her was the only other sound besides her breathing. David knelt by the sofa, his hand gently stroking a stray lock of hair from her pale face. He felt the familiar warmth of her skin, a small comfort in the vast coldness of their circumstances. He had spent the last 2 years fighting for her, fighting for them. His body was a roadmap of that struggle. There were calluses on his hands from work he was not meant for, and a faint thin scar on his wrist from a long-forgotten training exercise. The scar was a ghost of a life he had once been so proud of, a life he had given up for her. The room was a prison, but their love was the small garden within it. He leaned in and whispered, "I will get it, Rachel, I promise." Her eyes fluttered open, dark and deep. She managed a weak smile, a gesture of profound courage. "Don't give me that face, David." Her voice was raspy, but held a trace of her old playfulness. "You'll scare me more than this asthma does." He returned her smile, a tired effort. "You think I'd go looking like a fool? The button on my shirt is sewed back on. I'm ready." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cool and trembling. "You're not going to fail, David. You're going there to show them who you are, and they'll see it. They'll see the man who would stop the world just to make sure I am okay." His throat tightened. He didn't know if he could live up to that. He didn't want to carry all this on his shoulders, but what choice did he have? The job at Monarch Air was more than a paycheck. It was a lifeline. Real insurance, a way to afford the medication she so desperately needed. It was the only way to stop this endless, slow decay of their life. "I can't afford to mess this up, Rachel. This job, it means real treatment, a way to get you proper medication." Finally, she shook her head gently and set the mug down on the table. "Don't put all of this on your shoulders. You're not carrying me, David. We're walking together. Go there. Do your best. That's all I ask." He squeezed her hand tighter, his thumb stroking her knuckles. His voice dropped lower, almost shaking. "I'm not just going to try. I will get that job. I promise you. I won't let us lose this chance." Rachel smiled again, soft and steady. She had never once blamed him for their struggles. Even now, sick and exhausted, she offered nothing but encouragement. "I believe you," she whispered. "I always have." He pressed her hand against his chest, letting her feel his heartbeat hammering under her touch. "I won't fail you," he said again, this time more to himself than to her. The vow settled over him heavy and absolute. He stood and kissed her damp forehead, the single simple act a testament to all the hope and fear inside him. The bus ride to the airport was a blur of gray concrete and blurred faces. He kept his eyes fixed on the distant skyline, trying to calm the frantic beating of his heart. Every minute was a luxury he couldn't afford. He rehearsed his answers in his head, a mantra of ambition and desperation. He was more than a number on a resume. He was a man with a purpose, a man on a mission. The interview was his, he told himself. The job was his. He just had to get there. The terminal was a cacophony of sound and motion. Announcements boomed overhead, blending into a meaningless drone. The rumble of rolling suitcases, the chatter of 100 different conversations, the distant cry of a baby. David was swallowed by the noise, his senses overwhelmed. The boarding pass in his hand was damp, his knuckles white from gripping it too hard. He glanced up at the screen. Flight 237, Portland Gate, B8. Final boarding call. The words seemed to burn into his chest. Every second now was borrowed. He quickened his pace, weaving through rolling suitcases and distracted travelers. Sweat ran down his temple, soaking into the collar of his shirt. His heart hammered not only from the sprint, but from the weight of that vow. He had promised Rachel. He had looked into her eyes the night before and sworn he would not fail her. If he missed this flight, he wasn't just missing an interview. He was breaking the only lifeline his wife had left. The gate came into sight, a beacon of hope in the chaos. He could see the agent at the desk, the small line of people still boarding, their faces impassive. He pushed a little harder, his legs burning. He was almost there, just a few more feet. He could do this. He had to. He pictured Rachel's face, pale but hopeful, and that image fueled him. And then he saw her. At first, she was just a figure to the side near a vending machine, an elderly woman, thin and stooped, leaning heavily on a cane. She didn't look like much, just another traveler lost in the bustling crowd. Nobody else slowed down to notice, but David did. It was an instinct, a flicker of a memory from his old life. His eyes trained to see past the mundane, saw the small, significant details. He saw the way her free hand trembled, fingers twitching in the air as if she were reaching for balance. He saw her chest rise shallow and uneven. He heard the faint, wheezing gasp that was lost in the airport's noise but was as loud as a siren to him. It was the same desperate struggle that had haunted his nights with Rachel. His EMT instinct recognized the signs immediately. Respiratory distress, possible cardiac event. The woman's cane slipped from her grasp, clattering to the floor. The sharp crack drew a few heads around. She staggered, her knees giving way. People nearby gasped, but did not move closer. Some took a step back. A man muttered, "Someone should call for help," but stayed rooted to the spot. A teenager raised a phone, already recording. David's body was a tight knot of conflicting commands. Run. Get to the gate. You have to. You promised. But another voice, older and more profound, whispered to him, "You can't leave her. Not her." The decision was not easy. It was not a simple choice between right and wrong. It was a choice between two equally sacred vows. His promise to the woman he loved, and his unspoken oath to every human being in need. The world seemed to slow down. The clamor of the terminal faded into a distant hum. The gate, his last chance, was 100 feet away. The woman, frail and collapsing, was 30 feet away. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, a rush he had not felt in years. It was a powerful, undeniable force, a memory of a life dedicated to service. He had to choose. The world waited silent and unmoving to see what he would do. The image of Rachel's face, her hope, flashed in his mind. Then the image of the woman's trembling hands, her desperate struggle for air, replaced it. His legs, which had been driving him toward the gate, faltered. He stopped. He saw the gate agent look up at him, then glance at the clock. The jet bridge was a dark tunnel waiting to swallow his future. He saw the woman's body begin to crumple. The choice was not just a moral dilemma. It was a physical one, a battle of instincts. His hands, calloused from hauling crates, twitched. They remembered the feel of a person's wrist, the search for a pulse. His eyes, tired from lack of sleep, were suddenly sharp, scanning for the signs of a collapse. He could still make it. If he ran now, he could still get on the plane. The gate agent was watching him, perhaps wondering why he was hesitating. The woman was just a moment, a brief, inconvenient interruption. He could be on that plane, flying toward a new life, a life where Rachel would be safe, a life where he would no longer have to lie, no longer have to watch her suffer. It was all within his grasp. He just had to keep running. But his feet would not move. His mind, so focused on his destination, was suddenly flooded with a different purpose. It was not a thought. It was a feeling, a deep-seated truth buried under layers of exhaustion and desperation. He was an EMT. He was a man who helped. He had promised Rachel he would get the job, but he had also promised himself years ago that he would never turn away from someone in need. Both promises held an equal weight. The world seemed to hold its breath. The final boarding call was a distant echo. The woman's body was a fragile question mark. David stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Then his choice was made. It was not a decision he consciously made, but a path he was pulled toward. It was an inevitability, a return to the person he was always meant to be. He took a deep breath, his lungs burning with a familiar urgency. He looked once more at the gate, at the disappearing line of people, and let the image of his future fade away. He turned on his heel. He was running again, but this time he was not running toward a flight. He was running toward a stranger. He was running toward a past he had left behind, a past that had never truly let go of him. The sound of her cane clattering on the floor, the sight of her trembling hands, it was all he could see. He had promised Rachel, but he had also promised himself. And some promises he was beginning to understand were made not with words, but with a life's work. The world had dissolved into a single crystalline point of focus, the elderly woman's trembling body. David's mind, so recently a whirlwind of ambition and anxiety, became a calm, clear pool of instinct. The sounds of the terminal, the distant roar of a jet engine, the impatient murmur of the crowd, all of it faded into a muffled hum, a backdrop against which his own actions were the only things that mattered. He lunged forward, his long legs eating up the distance, his backpack bouncing against his spine with each powerful stride. His EMT training, a part of him he had thought long dormant, surged to life, a rush of cold clinical clarity. He caught her just as her knees buckled, his arm sliding under her armpit, his hand finding the firm support of her upper back. She was lighter than he had expected, fragile, like her bones might snap in his grip. He eased her to the floor, his knee hitting the tile hard with a sound that was surprisingly loud in the sudden silent pocket they had created. Her face was pale, eyes wide and unfocused, lips parting with a broken wheeze. David lowered himself completely, kneeling on the cold floor, his voice sharp but steady. "Ma'am, stay with me." He said, his words a command and a plea. He took her trembling hand in his fingers checking for a pulse while positioning her airway. "Breathe. Just breathe with me. You're not alone." Her eyes fluttered, darting without focus. A rasp escaped her throat, thin and weak. Her fingers twitched against his palm like she was trying to hold on to a fleeting piece of reality. David pressed his other hand gently against her back, feeling each shallow, desperate rise of her chest. He tilted her head to open her airway, his mind working on instinct, every movement pulled from his EMT training and memories of helping Rachel through countless asthma attacks. He saw the subtle blue tint to her lips, a sign of oxygen deprivation, and his mind, cold and efficient, began to assess the situation. He needed to get her more air. He needed help. Around them, a circle had formed, a ring of curious but unmoving spectators. People leaned forward, their faces a mixture of concern and morbid curiosity. A few had their phones out, the blue light of their screens reflecting in their eyes as they recorded the scene. No one knelt. No one came closer. A gate agent, a thin man with a perpetually bored expression, had picked up a phone, his face blank as he spoke into it. The isolation of the moment was profound. David was on an island of action in a sea of passive observation. He was a man with a purpose in a world of spectators. His throat tightened. He thought of Rachel in their dim living room, clutching her inhaler as she struggled to breathe, then forcing a smile just to calm him. He had promised her. He had sworn he would make the flight. His chance, her chance, their only chance. And now he was here on the dirty floor of an airport, holding the hand of a stranger who might die in front of him. He felt the woman's pulse faint and uneven. He bent close, his lips near her ear. "Don't give up," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "You hold on. You're not going anywhere yet." For a moment her gaze sharpened. Her eyes found his. She blinked, slow and deliberate, as though she understood him, a silent communication of thanks and trust. Then her chest hitched, another desperate gasp. "Come on," David urged, his voice breaking. "Don't quit on me, please." The seconds stretched into an eternity. His heart pounded louder than the announcements overhead. He wanted to stand up, to run for the gate, to scream that he had a reason, that he had a wife at home depending on him. He felt the pull of the closing jet bridge, the promise of a future waiting just beyond the glass. But his hands would not let go. His knees would not lift from the floor. He could not abandon her any more than he could abandon Rachel. He had made a choice, and now he had to see it through, regardless of the cost. He pressed harder on her back, gently, rhythmically, trying to encourage her lungs to work. He spoke to her in a low, continuous stream of reassurances, words he had learned to whisper to Rachel during her worst attacks. "It's okay, just breathe. You're doing great. I've got you." At last the sound of rushing footsteps approached. Paramedics appeared, pushing a stretcher, their voices brisk and efficient. One dropped to his knees beside David, checking the woman's pulse. "Sir, we've got her," the medic said firmly. "Thank you. Your quick response probably saved her life." David nodded, his body stiff as he let go of her hand. His palms were damp with sweat. His knees cracked as he pushed himself upright, his whole body trembling with adrenaline. He stood back watching as the medic slipped an oxygen mask over her face, strapped her to the stretcher-clipped monitors to her skin. Her eyes fluttered open again for the briefest second. She looked at him, not through him, not past him, but at him. Her lips moved faintly, no sound escaping, but her fingers twitched against the rail as if trying to reach him. David swallowed hard. He gave a small nod, his voice low-raw. "You're going to be all right." The medics wheeled her away, their stretcher vanishing into the stream of bodies. The crowd that had gathered quickly dispersed, travelers slipping back into their own urgent lives as though nothing had happened. David stood alone in the middle of the concourse, the silence of the aftermath a deafening roar. His chest collapsed in on itself. He turned his head slowly with a sickening sense of dread. The gate was closed. The door was sealed. Beyond the glass, the jet bridge was empty, already pulled away from the plane. His flight, their chance, it was gone. David stood frozen in front of the closed gate, his chest rising and falling as if he had just run a marathon. The boarding pass in his hand was crumpled. The ink blurred the paper, torn slightly at the corner where his fingers had dug in. Beyond the glass, the jet bridge was empty, already pulled away. The plane was gone. Portland was gone. His promise was gone. A buzzing sound came from his pocket. He pulled out his phone with trembling hands. The glow of the screen was harsh against his damp fingers. One new email. The subject line made his stomach twist. Monarch Air final interview. He tapped it open. "Dear Mr. Miller, we regret to inform you that due to your absence on the sponsored flight, we must withdraw your candidacy for the program coordinator position. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." The words blurred before his eyes. His thumb hovered above the screen as if waiting for the message to change, as if one more blink would make them say something else. But they didn't. They were final. They were cold. They were a door slamming shut on his dreams. He walked unsteadily to a row of empty chairs near the wall and sank down. His backpack slid off his shoulder and dropped to the floor with a thud. The phone buzzed again. This time it was Rachel's name glowing on the screen. His throat closed. How could he tell her that while she sat at home struggling to breathe, he had missed their only chance? Because he was kneeling on a dirty airport floor with a stranger's hand in his. "Tavidi!" Her voice was weak, raspy, punctuated by a cough that rattled through the receiver. He closed his eyes, every sound of her struggle cutting into him like a blade. "Did you make it? Are you on the plane?" His mouth opened, but no words came out. His lips trembled. "The flight was delayed," he whispered, forcing the lie through gritted teeth. "I'm still at the gate waiting." There was silence on the other end, broken only by the sound of her breathing, shallow and uneven. Then she coughed hard, the sound so violent that he sat up straighter in his chair, gripping the phone as if he could hold her through it. When it passed, her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "David, whatever happens, I know you did the right thing. You always do. That has to mean something." His eyes stung, his vision blurring. He swallowed hard, his throat burning. "I'll be home soon," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. "Okay, be safe." The line went quiet. He lowered the phone slowly, staring at the black screen as his reflection stared back at him, drawn pale eyes rimmed red. The rejection came quietly, without drama. An email from Monarch Air, polite and final. "We regret to inform you that due to your absence, we must withdraw your application." David read the line once, twice, and then shut the screen as if closing it could erase the truth. He did not tell Rachel. He could not. What mattered now was not Portland, not interviews, but survival, hers more than his. His walk home was a march of defeat. The city lights, once a promise of a better life, now seemed to mock him. The car horns and sirens, a familiar part of the urban symphony, were now a harsh, discordant noise. He felt like a ghost, a hollowed-out version of the man who had left home that morning. The world, it seemed, had little use for kindness. It valued schedules and efficiency and a cold, impersonal sense of ambition. He had made his choice, and the world had made its judgment. It was a harsh, undeniable lesson. The price of kindness was losing his dream job, and soon he was struggling to afford medicine for his wife. He arrived back at the apartment, the air inside stagnant and heavy. Rachel was still on the couch now, awake, a book resting on her chest. She looked up at him, her face filled with a hopeful anticipation that he couldn't bear to meet. He forced a tired smile, a lie worn thin by repetition. Still waiting on them to make a call. He said, his voice a little too cheerful. "Big company, you know. They take their time." Rachel nodded, her eyes soft with belief. She didn't press him, didn't question the late hour or the look of exhaustion etched into his face. She simply reached for his hand, her touch a comforting anchor in his sea of lies. "You did your best, David," she whispered. "That's all that matters to me." He sat down beside her, the weight of his secret pressing down on him, a heavy, suffocating blanket. He knew that the lie would only grow heavier with time. He knew that every time she coughed, every time he had to buy the cheapest generic medicine he could find, he would be reminded of the chance he had given up. But he also knew deep down that he wouldn't change a thing. He couldn't. The memory of the woman's fragile body, the look in her eyes as he stabilized her, it was a memory he would carry forever. It was his truth. It was his reason. And for the moment, it would have to be enough. The airport, a sprawling glass and steel monument to movement, had become a mausoleum of David's ambitions. He sat on a cold plastic chair, the crumpled boarding pass a tombstone in his hand. The weight of his failure was not a sudden crushing blow, but a slow, insidious seep of cold dread. He reread the email from Monarch Air. The words, so polite and final, were like tiny daggers, each one twisting in the open wound of his regret. "Due to your absence, we must withdraw your candidacy." He had known this was the risk, had understood the cost. But knowing and feeling were two very different things. The reality was a cold, bitter taste in his mouth. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over Rachel's name. A call from her would be a simple question. "Did you make it?" A question that would demand a truth he couldn't bring himself to speak. He could tell her the truth that he had helped a stranger, that he had chosen compassion over a career, that his promise had been broken for a more fundamental one. But what would that accomplish? It would only add his burden to her already fragile shoulders. He couldn't let her feel that his sacrifice was for nothing. He had to protect her not just from the outside world, but from the raw, painful reality of their situation. He chose the lesser evil. He chose the lie. The phone rang. It was her. He took a deep, shaky breath, forcing a cheerfulness into his voice that felt like a costume. "Hey, babe," he said, his lips trembling slightly. "David, did you make it? Are you on the plane?" Her voice was a fragile melody, punctuated by a soft, rattling cough that echoed through the receiver. It was the sound of his failure, the living, breathing proof of what he had lost. The flight was delayed. He whispered the lie, a bitter taste on his tongue. He hated the word, hated the way it felt so natural to him now. "I'm still at the gate waiting." There was a pause, a moment of silence broken only by the sound of her shallow, uneven breathing. He held the phone so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He imagined her sitting on the sofa, her hand on her chest, her eyes wide with fear and hope. Then she coughed, a violent tearing sound that made him sit up straighter in the cold plastic chair. He closed his eyes, every sound of her struggle cutting into him like a blade. When it passed, her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "David, whatever happens, I know you did the right thing. You always do. That has to mean something." Her words were a cruel gift, a testament to her unwavering belief in him. They stung more than any accusation, more than any anger. He felt a hot, blurring sensation behind his eyes. He swallowed hard, his throat burning. "I'll be home soon," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. "Okay. Be safe." The line went quiet. He lowered the phone slowly, staring at the black screen as his reflection stared back at him. A ghost of a man drawn, pale eyes rimmed red. He shut the screen as if closing it could erase the truth. He did not tell Rachel. He could not. What mattered now was not Portland, not interviews, but survival, hers more than his. His journey home was a march of defeat. The bus, once a vehicle of anticipation, was now a cramped box of regret. He watched the city lights flash by, each one a mockery of the brightness he had hoped for. The car horns and sirens, a familiar part of the urban symphony, were now a harsh, discordant noise. He felt like a ghost, a hollowed-out version of the man who had left home that morning. The world, it seemed, had little use for kindness. It valued schedules and efficiency and a cold, impersonal sense of ambition. He had made his choice, and the world had made its judgment. It was a harsh, undeniable lesson. The price of kindness was losing his dream job, and soon he was struggling to afford medicine for his wife. He arrived back at the apartment, the air inside stagnant and heavy. Rachel was still on the couch now, awake, a book resting on her chest. She looked up at him, her face filled with a hopeful anticipation that he couldn't bear to meet. He forced a tired smile, a lie worn thin by repetition. "Still waiting on them to make a call," he said, his voice a little too cheerful. "Big company, you know. They take their time." Rachel nodded, her eyes soft with belief. She didn't press him, didn't question the late hour or the look of exhaustion etched into his face. She simply reached for his hand, her touch a comforting anchor in his sea of lies. "You did your best, David," she whispered. "That's all that matters to me." He sat down beside her, the weight of his secret pressing down on him, a heavy, suffocating blanket. He knew that the lie would only grow heavier with time. He knew that every time she coughed, every time he had to buy the cheapest generic medicine he could find, he would be reminded of the chance he had given up. The next morning his new life began. He walked past the bus terminal where men waited for day work, their faces etched with a familiar weariness. He joined them, a ghost in a sea of ghosts. By noon he was carrying crates heavy enough to split his back. His hands rubbed raw against splintered wood. The foreman, a gruff man with a permanent scowl, never learned his name. He was just, "Kid, you there?" or "Hey." The job was brutal, a relentless assault on his body. He felt the muscles in his back protest with every lift, his hands growing rougher, the soft skin of his palms giving way to calluses and blisters. When that job ended, he sought another. At a construction site, he hauled sand, mixed cement, took orders from foremen who never learned his name. The sun beat down on him, baking the sweat into his clothes, making him feel like a desiccated husk. At night, when his body begged to rest, he signed on at a warehouse stacking boxes until his vision blurred and his arms shook under the weight. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, menacing hum, and the air was thick with the smell of cardboard and dust. Every day followed the same rhythm, sweat, ache, exhaustion. And yet every morning before stepping through his own door, he stopped at the pharmacy. He counted out wrinkled bills, coins worn from his pocket, buying the cheapest generic albuterol he could find to keep Rachel's airways open. He carried the small paper bag home like it was a treasure, a sacred offering. When he entered the apartment, he always smiled. He set the medicine by her bedside and kissed her damp forehead. "Got what you need," he whispered, as if nothing had broken, as if the world was still holding steady. Rachel was no fool. She saw the grime on his shirt sleeves, the swollen knuckles, the shadows under his eyes. But she never confronted him. She only rested her thin hand on his wrist and smiled, the wheeze still rattling in her chest. "I believe in you," she whispered one night, her voice rasping but steady. "I only need you to come home." David's throat tightened. He turned away, pretending to fold a blanket, hiding the sting in his eyes. "I'm still waiting on word," he said softly, forcing lightness into his tone. "Any day now." The lie was heavier than the crates, sharper than the blisters tearing open on his palms. But if the cost of keeping her hope alive was his silence, then he would bear it. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of hauling scrap metal, David stood in the small bathroom looking at his reflection. The man staring back was a stranger. His eyes, once bright with determination, were now dull and hollowed. His shoulders were slumped, his face was gaunt, and a faint stubble covered his jaw. He saw not the man who had promised a better life, but a man drowning in a sea of broken promises. He felt the deep burning ache in his bones, the constant fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. He was a vessel for labor and lies. He had no more room for hope. He had to keep pushing for Rachel's sake, but he wondered how long he could last. He wondered if this was the rest of his life. A life of silence, of pain, of quiet desperation. A life he had bought with one single selfless act. The rhythm of David's life became a monotonous, grinding hum, a slow decay of both body and spirit. 3 weeks stretched into an eternity of sweat pain and silence. His days began before dawn, a raw, cold awakening that came long before his body had felt rested. He would leave the apartment careful not to wake Rachel and walk toward the bus terminal, where men gathered like weary birds waiting for the first crumbs of work. His jobs were a blur of physical brutality, hauling sacks of cement that left his arms trembling, pushing heavy carts in warehouses until his legs ached with a deep marrow-deep fatigue, shoveling snow from rooftops during an unexpected late-season storm, the cold seeping through his worn gloves and numbing his fingers. He was a ghost in his own city. He stopped looking at the faces in the bus and the people on the street. They were a world apart from him, a world that moved with a different kind of purpose, a world that was not burdened by the need to hide its brokenness. He saw friends and old colleagues in passing, but he ducked his head, feigning a need to check his phone or tie a shoe. He could not bear to face their questions. The lie was a heavy shield, and it was getting harder to lift every day. He ate what he could, a cheap sandwich or a bowl of instant noodles, and saved every spare dollar. His entire life, his very being, was now funneled into a single desperate goal to keep Rachel alive. The small, constant wheeze that emanated from Rachel's chest became the soundtrack to his life. It was a reminder of his failure, but also the reason for his strength. He would come home, his body a symphony of aches and bruises, and force a tired smile. The ritual was always the same. He would set the small paper bag of generic medication on the nightstand, its crinkled edges a testament to his sacrifice. He would kiss Rachel on the forehead, pretending that everything was all right, that the world was still holding steady. She would look at him with a love so pure and unwavering that it was almost unbearable. Her quiet trust was a weight heavier than any crate he had ever lifted. One afternoon, a cold, miserable rain began to fall, turning the city into a wash of gray. David was walking home from the corner pharmacy, the paper bag of medicine clutched tightly in his hand. The chill seeped into his bones, and he hunched his shoulders against the wind, his head bent low. He was just a few blocks from their apartment, lost in the weary rhythm of his own steps, when he saw her. An elderly woman sat on a sagging wooden porch, her body folded into a chair too big for her small frame. A faded scarf tied loosely under her chin framed her face. The rain had not reached her corner of the world, a small, dry haven in the midst of the wet afternoon. For a moment, David's breath caught. He knew that face. Pale skin, trembling hands. The same fragile frame he had held on that airport floor. His heart, which had been beating in a dull, exhausted rhythm for weeks, gave a sudden hard jolt. He slowed, uncertain. The woman looked up, and their eyes met. Recognition struck him with a jolt. She smiled gently, the lines in her face folding with ease. "You're the young man from the airport," she said, her voice caught between disbelief and politeness. "The one who saved my life." "You're the lady from the airport," he said, his voice raw with surprise. He didn't know what to say. He shifted the bag of medicine in his hand, feeling the cheap plastic crinkle, a stark contrast to the quiet dignity of the woman before him. "I'm David Miller. I'm just glad you're okay. You gave us all quite a scare that day." "Indeed I did," Margaret said, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "My doctor says, if you hadn't acted so quickly, stabilized my breathing the way you did, well, I might not be sitting here today." "Were you a medic?" "EMT years ago." David admitted the words, feeling foreign on his tongue. He had not spoken of that life in a long time. "Before, life got complicated." Margaret nodded slowly, studying his face with keen, intelligent eyes. "Life has a way of testing us, doesn't it? But character reveals itself in moments like those." "Thank you, David Miller. My name is Margaret Smith. I've been staying with my niece in this neighborhood while I recover." A small, uneasy silence hung in the air. David felt a desperate need to leave. He was not the man he had been at the airport, confident and capable in a crisis. He was a man who worked 3 jobs just to keep his wife breathing, a man who lived a lie every single day. He had nothing to offer this woman but the grim truth of his existence. He forced a smile. "I hope whatever brought you to that airport that day worked out for you, David." He looked back, forcing the lie through gritted teeth. It'll work out. These things always do." But Margaret caught the shadow that crossed his face, the way his shoulders sagged just slightly. She watched him walk away, noting the worn shoes, the careful way he held the pharmacy bag, the weight of worry he carried in every step. As David's figure disappeared around the corner, Margaret's expression shifted. The warm, kind face became thoughtful lines of calculation appearing around her eyes. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, sleek phone, a device that looked far too modern for her unassuming appearance. She dialed a number from memory. A crisp, professional voice answered. "Yes, Ms. Bradford." Margaret's voice, now calm and commanding, belied her Margaret Smith persona. "Eleanor, it's me. I'm still in the city. There's a young man I need you to look into. His name is David Miller. I need you to find everything you can on him. His work history, his family, his financial situation. Don't call anyone who knows me. Be discreet. I want to know everything about him from the moment he left the ambulance service." "Of course, Ms. Bradford. Is this a personal matter?" "It is." Margaret said, her gaze fixed on the empty corner where David had vanished. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof of her porch, but she didn't seem to notice. "He's the young man who helped me at the airport. I have a feeling that his life has not worked out as he claimed. I have a feeling that his kindness cost him more than he'll ever admit. I want to know the whole story." The line was silent for a moment as Eleanor processed the request. "Understood. I will have the file on your desk in 2 days." Margaret ended the call. She sat for a long time listening to the steady rhythm of the rain, the sound a quiet accompaniment to her thoughts. She had seen countless acts of ambition in her life, countless people who would do anything to get ahead. But she had never seen an act of selflessness so profound, so complete. The man who had given up everything for a stranger deserved more than just a passing thank you. He deserved a second chance, and she, in her position, was in a unique place to give it to him. The game had changed. It was no longer a simple story of a kind deed. It was now a story of redemption, a story that she, Margaret Bradford, was now determined to write. 2 weeks after his brief, awkward encounter with Margaret Smith, David's life had settled back into its grim, predictable rhythm. The lie he told Rachel about the job interview had grown heavier, a physical weight on his shoulders. The cold rain from that day had passed, replaced by a gray, oppressive humidity that made every breath thick and heavy. His body, already exhausted from the endless cycle of manual labor, felt a deeper, more profound weariness. His clothes hung a little looser, the shadows under his eyes had become permanent fixtures, and the laugh lines around his mouth, once so prominent, had faded into a tired, grim straightness. He was a man made of toil and silence. He was on his way home from a construction site, his body a symphony of aches and bruises, when he encountered Margaret again. She stood near the curb outside a small grocery store, one hand on her cane, the other struggling to balance a heavy bag of produce. The sack sagged dangerously, its weight pulling her sideways. She tried to lift it into a small cart, but her arms shook, and for a split second she looked as though she might fall. David didn't hesitate. His body moved on its own, a reflex that was older and more deeply ingrained than his exhaustion. He set down his own things and moved quickly. "Here, let me help you," he said, catching the bag before it tore. Margaret looked up, genuine surprise flickering in her eyes before it warmed into recognition. "David, how kind of you." David hoisted the sack into the cart with ease and brushed the dust from his palms. "These bags are too heavy for you. You need to be careful." "I thought I could manage," Margaret said softly. "Living alone again, you know. You forget how to ask for help." She studied his face, noting the deeper shadows under his eyes, the way his clothes hung a little looser than before. "David, you look tired. Are you taking care of yourself?" His eyes flicked to the fading light. He was standing on a public street, his body screaming with the truth of his lie. "I'm fine. Just working a lot these days." He gathered his things quickly. "I should get home. My wife's waiting for her medication." "Of course," Margaret said gently, her voice full of a genuine concern that made his throat tighten. "Give her my regards." As David hurried away, Margaret remained by her cart, watching his retreating figure with growing concern. She had seen the file Eleanor had sent. She knew everything. The crushing medical debt, the 3 jobs, the endless cycle of struggle. His lie, so transparent and painful, was a testament to his pride, to his desperate need to protect Rachel. Margaret had seen enough of life to recognize a man carrying more than his fair share of burden. She knew what she had to do. 2 weeks passed before Margaret made her move. She had spent the time studying the file, confirming her growing conviction. David Miller was exactly the kind of person the world needed more of. His selflessness at the airport was not a random act of heroism. It was a fundamental part of his character. He was a man who, when faced with an impossible choice, had chosen compassion. She arranged for a driver and a car, an act of practicality that felt like a secret operation in her mind. She put on a simple dress and a quiet scarf, choosing to be Margaret Smith again. She wasn't there to offer a business deal. She was there to offer a hand to see the truth with her own eyes. Rain drummed against the cracked window panes when the knock came at David's door. He opened it to find Margaret, her scarf damp, her shoulders hunched, but in her hands she held a paper bag filled with bread and soup. "I brought some bread and soup," she said, her voice soft, eyes almost shy. "I wanted to properly thank you for not leaving me at that airport." David hesitated only a second before stepping aside. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly, but his tone was kind. "Come in. It's miserable out there." Margaret settled into the corner chair, the one with a tear in the fabric that Rachel had stitched years ago. The room smelled faintly of dust and boiled tea, a scent that was a universe away from the polished leather and faint perfume of her own life. She introduced herself to Rachel as a temporary neighbor, and the 3 spoke quietly about the storm about the neighborhood. David tried to hide his fatigue, constantly glancing at Rachel, his body positioned near her inhaler. He saw the way Margaret's eyes moved, taking in every detail. The worn furniture, the patched-up pillow, the obvious love that radiated from every gesture between him and Rachel. He felt exposed, as if a part of his carefully constructed wall was crumbling. Then Rachel began to cough. At first, it was a small tremor, a sound David knew all too well, but it grew sharper, deeper, until her body shook with the effort. Her face drained of color, lips edging toward a pale blue chest, rising in desperate, uneven gasps. "Rachel!" David's voice cracked as he dropped to her side. He lifted her gently, guiding her upright, his arm firm around her back. With practiced efficiency, he grabbed the inhaler, shaking it once before pressing it to her lips. "Slowly, sweetheart, breathe with me." Margaret watched in silence as David worked with the calm precision of someone who had done this countless times before. She saw the fear in his eyes, the tenderness in his touch, the way he never once lost his composure, even as his world threatened to collapse around him. He was not just a husband. He was a first responder, a man of action and compassion. This wasn't a choice he was making in a moment of crisis. This was who he was in the quiet moments when no one important was watching. This was his character. When Rachel's breathing finally steadied, when the color returned to her cheeks, Margaret knew she had seen enough. This man's goodness wasn't circumstantial. It was his essence. She watched as David held Rachel's hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles, a silent promise of protection. She saw the relief that washed over his face, a momentary break in his mask of exhaustion. Margaret stood up quietly. "I think I should go now," she said softly. "Thank you for letting me visit." David nodded, still crouched by Rachel's side. "Thank you for the soup." Margaret left the apartment and walked out into the rain. The driver held a large umbrella over her head, but she barely noticed. She sat in the back of the car, looking out at the rain-streaked window. She had a new clarity now. She wasn't just helping a man who had helped her. She was investing in a man who was the living embodiment of her company's core values. She was offering a hand to a good man who had been crushed by a world that didn't reward his kind of kindness. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with swift, practiced efficiency. She dialed Eleanor's number again. "Eleanor, it's Margaret. I want you to prepare a comprehensive proposal for a new community outreach division. I want it on my desk by morning. We'll present it to the board next week. And..." Her voice dropped, becoming a low, commanding whisper. "I want you to find a way to get an interview invitation to a David Miller. I don't want it to look like a standard corporate letter. Make it personal. Make it clear that I'm the one who wants to see him. and don't mention the program. Not yet. We need him to come in with an open mind. Understood, Ms. Bradford. Eleanor's voice was sharp and professional. Margaret leaned back in the plush leather seat. The rain outside was a gentle drumbeat against the roof of the car. She thought of David's face, tired but determined as he helped his wife. She thought of the love that filled their small apartment. The world had tested him. It had taken everything from him, and now she would be the one to give it back. 3 more weeks passed in a blur of relentless, bone-deep fatigue for David. The rhythm of his life was set in stone: the early morning walk, the back-breaking jobs, the quiet evenings pretending to be fine. The lie about the Monarch Air job had become a part of him, a second skin he wore to protect Rachel. Hope that fragile and dangerous thing had long since been packed away. It was a luxury he couldn't afford. He and Rachel had settled into a quiet, loving companionship, built on a foundation of shared struggle and his profound, painful silence. Then one Tuesday morning, as a weak shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, an envelope appeared under their door. It was an ordinary envelope, a creamy white color, but it stood out against the worn linoleum like a beacon. David picked it up, his brow furrowed in confusion. It was addressed to him in an elegant looping script. The return address was simply M. Bradford. He opened it with a strange sense of dread. Inside was a simple card with elegant letterhead, its texture smooth and expensive under his rough fingertips. The Monarch Air logo, once a symbol of his failed dreams, was now a small, discreet watermark in the corner. The message was short and to the point. Mr. Miller, I would like to offer you an interview opportunity. Please meet me at Monarch Air headquarters Friday at 10:00 a.m. Monsieur Bradford? David stared at the card, his pulse quickening with a mixture of disbelief and fear. He showed it to Rachel, whose eyes widened with cautious hope. Do you think it's real? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question was a reflection of their current reality. So much had gone wrong that they had forgotten how to trust good fortune. I don't know, David admitted, his mind racing. It had to be a mistake, or a cruel joke. He had already received his final rejection, but the card was personal, the signature a single letter. He thought of his last fleeting encounter with Margaret Smith, the woman from the airport. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Was this connected to her? But her name was Margaret Smith, and the card was from an M. Bradford. But we don't have much left to lose, he said, a grim truth. The next few days were a blur of nervous anticipation. David had no idea what to expect. He didn't even know what position he was supposedly being interviewed for. He still had his old, now-worn interview suit. Rachel spent hours cleaning and pressing it, her hands moving with a meticulous care that spoke of her fragile hope. On Thursday night, she insisted on making his favorite meal, a simple pasta dish, and they ate in a quiet, tense silence. They didn't talk about the interview. The topic was too fraught with the ghosts of their past failures. They simply held hands across the table, their gazes filled with a silent, mutual understanding. Friday came with a cold wind that rattled the loose window panes of their apartment. David helped Rachel into her coat. She insisted on coming with him. We're in this together, David. She had said, a gentle but firm statement that he couldn't argue with. They made their way downtown, a journey that felt like crossing into a foreign country. The Monarch Air headquarters loomed above them, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun, a sharp and brilliant contrast to the gray, cramped world they had just left. For a moment, David felt out of place, his calloused hands tugging nervously at the sleeve of his only clean jacket. The shoes he had polished so meticulously felt worn and scuffed against the sleek, polished marble of the lobby. A receptionist with a smile that was perfectly polite and utterly impersonal guided them into a quiet, wood-paneled office. The scent of polished leather and faint, expensive perfume lingered in the air, a scent that felt like a challenge to David's senses. He sat down on a plush sofa, Rachel beside him, her hand gripping his tightly. Their eyes darted around the room, taking in the framed awards on the walls, the sweeping view of the city, and the large, imposing desk in the center of the room. At the desk sat Margaret Bradford. Rachel gasped softly. David, she whispered, her eyes wide with recognition. David froze his breath, catching in his throat. The woman was older, her hair styled differently, her clothes a crisp, commanding business suit that hung on her frail frame with elegant authority. But it was her eyes, the same warm, intelligent eyes he had looked into at the airport and on the porch that he recognized. The same eyes that had watched him and Rachel in their tiny apartment. "Margaret Smith," he said slowly, the name feeling like a question on his tongue. "Except, you're not, are you?" Margaret rose with a quiet dignity, her presence filling the room. She was not fragile now, but commanding a woman of immense power and quiet authority. Yet her eyes held the same warmth they had shown in his tiny apartment. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "My name is Margaret Bradford," she said evenly. "I co-founded Monarch Air 30 years ago." David's mouth opened, but no words came. He stared at her, at the woman who had pretended to be a frail, temporary neighbor who had watched his struggle and the quiet desperation of his life. 1,000 questions rushed through his mind, but they all converged on one central dizzying point of confusion. Why? Why the deception? Why the observation? Margaret walked around her desk and stood before them, a presence that was both powerful and gentle. "When I met you at that airport when you saved my life," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I chose not to reveal who I was immediately. I needed to understand who you really were. And what I discovered, well, what I discovered was a man whose actions in moments of crisis were a reflection of his true character." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes bright with understanding. "You were testing him," Margaret corrected her gently. "Not testing, observing. When someone saves your life, you want to know if it was circumstance or character. In my position, I've learned that true character is revealed not in moments of glory, but in quiet moments when no one important is watching." She paused, her gaze resting on David. "You didn't just save my life at the airport, David. You saved it a second time at the grocery store without knowing who I was. And then you invited me into your home where I witnessed the true depth of your love and sacrifice. I saw your kindness, your compassion, your exhaustion." David sank back into the sofa, the full weight of her words hitting him. The long, lonely weeks of struggle, the lie he had told, the sacrifice he had made, the quiet surveillance he had been under, it all came rushing back to him in a dizzying wave. He had lost everything, and all the while a quiet observer had been watching, judging, and waiting. And in that moment, he realized that the door that had slammed shut on his past life might just be the one that was about to open on his future. The silence in the opulent office was thick and heavy, a stark contrast to the quiet dignity of the woman who now stood before them. David and Rachel sat on the plush sofa, their minds reeling from the revelation. The woman they had known as Margaret Smith, a temporary neighbor, was in fact Margaret Bradford, the co-founder and CEO of Monarch Air. David's mind, accustomed to the brutal simplicity of manual labor, struggled to grasp the complexity of the situation. Every interaction, every word spoken, every silent observation, all of it now had a new, profound meaning. The soup, the grocery bag, the torn chair in their living room, they were not just moments of kindness, but pieces of an elaborate puzzle he had been a part of without even knowing. Margaret walked over to a window that overlooked the sprawling city skyline, her back to them. The power that radiated from her was palpable, yet it was not cold or intimidating. It was simply a fact of her being. "You've been watching us for weeks," David said, his voice a hoarse whisper. It was an accusation, and a statement of disbelief rolled into one. "I've been grateful for weeks," Margaret replied, her voice soft, but carrying an unshakable conviction. She turned back to face them, her eyes once again the warm, knowing eyes from his apartment. "When you helped me at the airport, David, it was an act of pure character. You had every reason to leave me there. You had a job interview, a sick wife, a future that depended on that flight. You chose to stay. I've seen countless people in my life make the easy choice, the one that serves their self-interest. You made the hard one, and you made it twice. You helped me again at the grocery store without knowing who I was. That man," she said, her voice rising slightly, a note of passion entering her tone. "That man deserved more than just a thank you note." She moved to her desk and opened a folder. The faint rustle of paper was the only sound in the room. "Can I tell you something about my company, David? Monarch Air started 30 years ago, when my late husband and I decided we were tired of seeing airlines treat people like cargo. We built our business on a simple idea that how you treat people in small moments defines who you are in big ones. We believe in humanity, in compassion, in dignity. She looked at him directly, her gaze holding his. "I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion for someone you love. I've seen you provide emergency medical care without hesitation, without thought of reward. These aren't coincidences, David. This is who you are." She pulled out a set of documents from the folder. 3 months ago, our board approved funding for a new community outreach division. We want to partner with local businesses, hospitals, and social services to create support networks for families exactly like yours. But we needed the right person to lead it. Someone who understood struggle, who had genuine empathy, who could connect with people facing impossible choices. David's throat tightened. He already knew the answer. It was a truth that was so powerful it felt like a dream. "And you think, that's me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I know it's you," Margaret said firmly. "I've seen your compassion in a way that no resume could ever capture. I've seen your resolve, your empathy, your goodness. This isn't charity. This position requires someone who can work with medical professionals, coordinate with social services, and yes, sometimes provide emergency assistance. Your EMT background isn't just relevant, it's essential." She placed the documents on the desk. "The position comes with full health benefits, not just for you, but for Rachel. It includes coverage for pre-existing conditions, experimental treatments, and a pharmaceutical allowance that would cover her medications completely. This is the job you were meant to have." Rachel began to cry, but these were tears of relief, of possibility. She reached for David's hand, her fingers trembling as they intertwined with his. He stared at the folder, the crisp, clean paper a world away from the grimy, calloused hands that held it. He saw the words, "Comprehensive Health Care Plan," "Pharmaceutical Allowance," "Full Coverage." Words he had dreamed of, prayed for, but had never truly believed existed for people like them. But Margaret continued, her voice gentle. "I need to be clear about something. This isn't a gift. This is an investment. I believe in you, but I also believe in due diligence. We've already verified your certifications can be reactivated. Your former supervisor at the ambulance service, Maria Rodriguez, says you were one of the best EMTs she ever worked with. She also said you left to take care of a sick family member, and that if you ever wanted to come back to medical work, she'd hire you in a heartbeat." David looked up, startled. "You checked my EMT status." "I am a businesswoman, David," Margaret said with a small, knowing smile. "I believe in people, but I believe in information more. Your record is impeccable." The room fell silent except for the sound of Rachel's quiet, tearful breathing. David reached for her hand and she squeezed it tightly, the warmth of her touch a grounding force. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "The emergency you helped me through at the airport. My doctor says that without immediate intervention, I would have died. Not might have. Would have. My heart had stopped effectively functioning. Your actions didn't just help me, David. They saved my life completely. The man who missed his flight to save my life is now sitting in my office, qualified for a position he doesn't even know we'd created, specifically for someone like him. Some people might call that coincidence. I call it the universe correcting itself." David bowed his head, the weight of exhaustion mixing with a new fragile hope. He had spent months believing he had failed, that he had sacrificed everything for nothing. But here, in this quiet, elegant office, he was being told that his act of selflessness was not a failure, but a foundation. His past was not a burden, but a resume. His struggle was not a punishment, but a training ground. "Thank you," he whispered, the words choked with emotion. "I won't waste this chance." "I don't believe you could if you tried," Margaret replied. Her smile was genuine, and for the first time in a long time, David felt a profound sense of peace. The storm of his life was finally beginning to pass. The Monarch Air headquarters was a universe away from the world David had known. The air, crisp and scentless from 1,000 filters, was a stark contrast to the dust and grime of construction sites. The low hum of computers and the quiet tapping of keyboards replaced the roar of trucks and the clang of metal. On his first day, David felt like a man from another time. He walked with an unfamiliar stiffness, his new suit feeling more like a costume than clothing. His hands, still rough from months of hard labor, felt out of place on the smooth, polished conference table. He was the man who had worked with his hands, surrounded by a world that worked with its minds. His new office, a simple but well-lit space with a large window, felt like a gift he was not yet worthy of. He sat at the desk, the folders and documents before him, a jumble of alien concepts, strategic planning, budget allocation, stakeholder outreach. He was a man who had understood need on a visceral level in the shallow breaths of his wife and the desperate tremors of a stranger. This new language of business felt cold and impersonal. But he was not alone. Margaret had assigned him an assistant, a sharp, kind woman named Amelia, who patiently walked him through the company's internal systems. She saw his confusion not with judgment, but with an understanding born of a quiet respect for his journey. "You have a perspective no one else here does, David," she had said to him on his second day. "Don't let them make you lose it." The most profound and immediate change, however, was not in the office, but at home. The first time he walked into a proper pharmacy, a place clean and well lit, and handed over Rachel's prescription, the feeling was surreal. He watched the pharmacist count out the name brand inhalers, the cost of which would have been a month's wages just weeks before. He felt a wave of dizzying relief. He no longer had to count coins, no longer had to buy the cheapest generic he could find. He was simply a man providing for his family. Rachel's health improved at a pace that felt miraculous. The coughing fits, once a daily torment, became less frequent, then finally a distant memory. The wheezing that had been the constant soundtrack of their lives faded into a natural, easy breath. She began to regain her strength, the color returning to her cheeks, the spark in her eyes rekindled. She no longer slept with a hand on her chest. She no longer had to conserve her energy for simple tasks. Their apartment, once a place of quiet, tense endurance, became a home again. They would cook together in the evenings, laughing a sound that had been absent for so long. They would sit on the sofa, not in strained silence, but in comfortable companionship. Their hands linked the fear that had once been their constant companion, now just a ghost in the background. His new life, it turned out, was not just a reward for his good deed. It was a purpose. David's first project was to establish a partnership with a local hospital to provide free pharmaceutical consultations for low-income families. He found that the corporate language he was learning melted away when he sat across from doctors and social workers. His EMT experience, his raw empathy, and his lived understanding of struggle were more powerful than any spreadsheet. He was a bridge. He could speak their language of need, and he could translate it into the language of corporate logistics. He met Carmen, a nurse who had been working in the hospital's understaffed emergency department for years. She had seen countless families like David's families, who had to choose between rent and medication. When David explained his vision for the program, she looked at him with an awe that was both humbling and validating. "You don't just see the patient," she said. "You see the person. You see the whole story." Carmen, impressed by his humanity and insight, quickly became a liaison between the hospital and the program. He also reached out to Eddie, a man he had worked with at the warehouse, a kind-hearted man who was struggling to afford his own son's insulin. David had not seen Eddie in weeks, and the man's face was even more haggard than David's had been. David approached him not as a former co-worker, but as a program director. He helped Eddie navigate the new support system, and within a week, Eddie's son had the medication he needed. Eddie, filled with a new sense of hope and purpose, became one of the program's first dedicated volunteers. David was not just managing a division. He was building a community. He trained his staff not just on protocols and paperwork, but on empathy. He told them his story, a simple, painful truth about the cost of a single decision. He taught them to look for the shadows under people's eyes, to listen for the subtle hesitations in their voices. He taught them to see the whole story. The transformation was not just professional. The exhaustion that had once consumed him was now replaced by a deep sense of fulfillment. His body still ached sometimes, but it was the ache of a productive day, not a punishing one. He had stopped looking at his reflection with disdain. He saw a man who had lost everything, and then, through a series of unexpected events, had gained a life far more meaningful than the one he had planned. He was no longer a ghost in his own city. He was a man with a purpose, a man whose kindness had not been a mistake but a foundation. He sat in his office late one evening, the city lights twinkling below him. He took a deep breath, and it was easy and full of sound he had not taken for granted in a very long time. He looked at the framed picture of him and Rachel on his desk, their smiles tired but full of love. He saw her face full of color and life, a testament to what his sacrifice had wrought. He understood now. The journey had been long, the pain had been real, but the destination, this new life, was worth every single step. 6 months had passed since David's life had been irrevocably altered. 6 months that had felt both like a dream and a lifetime. The Community Outreach Division was no longer a small, fledgling idea on paper. It was a vibrant, living entity. Under David's leadership, it had grown beyond anyone's expectations. It was a model of empathetic community service, a testament to the power of human connection. The press had taken notice. The local news had run a series of stories on its success, featuring testimonials from families who had been helped. The Monarch Air Board, once skeptical, was now fully invested, pouring resources into a program that was not only doing good, but was also, they were finding, a profound source of goodwill for the company. The courtyard outside Monarch Air's new Community Outreach Division was alive with voices and laughter. Banners fluttered in the late afternoon breeze bearing the program's logo and mission statement. A stage had been set up, a simple podium, and a microphone standing ready for the day's celebration. Employees, community leaders, and local families who had benefited from the program mingled in the crowd, their faces a tapestry of hope and gratitude. David stood at the podium in a simple but well-fitted suit. He no longer felt like a man in a costume. This was his space. This was his purpose. His hands, still bearing the faint calluses of his old life, were steady as he spoke about dignity, compassion, and second chances. His voice, once quiet and filled with the weariness of lies, carried clear across the gathered crowd. When we started this initiative, David said, looking out over the crowd, we had a simple goal to bridge the gap between people in crisis and the resources that could help them. We didn't want to do it as charity, but as community. Not as saviors, but as neighbors. He paused, his eyes finding several familiar faces in the crowd. There was Carmen, the nurse from the hospital who had given him those pamphlets months ago, now serving as a liaison between the hospital and their program, her face beaming with pride. Eddie from the warehouse sat in the third row, having become one of their most dedicated volunteers after David helped him navigate his own family's medical crisis. He saw the Rodriguez family, whose daughter, thanks to the program, was no longer missing school due to untreated asthma attacks. 6 months ago, I was working 3 jobs just to afford my wife's basic medication. David continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tone. The crowd was silent, leaning in. I know what it feels like to choose between rent and prescriptions, between hope and despair. This program exists because we believe no one should have to make those choices alone. The audience murmured in agreement. Several people wiped their eyes as David spoke about the families they'd helped. The single mother whose son needed insulin. The elderly veteran who'd been rationing his heart medication. The young father who'd been working 7 days a week just to afford his daughter's asthma treatments. David's words were not a corporate speech. They were a testimony. We've learned that crisis doesn't discriminate, David said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. It touches the working poor, the middle class struggling with medical debt, the elderly on fixed incomes. But we've also learned that community response doesn't have to discriminate either. When businesses, healthcare providers, and social services work together, when we see people as human beings, rather than problems to be solved, remarkable things happen. In the front row, Rachel sat upright, healthier than she had been in years, her breathing easy and natural, thanks to the proper treatment she was finally receiving. Beside her sat Margaret, whose own transformation had been remarkable to watch. The program had become her personal passion project, and she'd thrown the full weight of Monarch Air's resources behind it. She looked at David, a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. He was everything she had hoped he would be. Today marks the expansion of our program to 3 additional communities, David announced. But more importantly, it marks the establishment of our emergency response training initiative. He gestured to a group of young people sitting near the front. These 12 individuals have completed our first EMT certification course, fully funded by the program. They're not just certified first responders now. They're community advocates trained to see medical emergencies in the context of social and economic challenges. Among the graduates was Maria Santos, a young woman whose grandmother David had helped during one of his first community calls. She'd been inspired by his approach, treating not just the medical crisis, but understanding the family's broader struggles, and had enrolled in the program immediately. But the real measure of our success, David continued, his voice filled with emotion, isn't in numbers or statistics. It's in the phone call I received last week from Mrs. Chen telling me her husband's diabetes is finally under control because he can afford his medication. It's in the email from the Rodriguez family saying their daughter made the honor roll because she's no longer missing school due to untreated asthma attacks. He paused, emotion threading through his voice. It's in the knowledge that when people in our community face impossible choices, they're not facing them alone anymore. The applause was warm and sustained. As it died down, Margaret joined him on stage. She clasped his hand firmly, her eyes bright with satisfaction. 6 months ago, Margaret said, taking the microphone, I had what doctors called a widowmaker heart attack in an airport terminal. A stranger, this man stopped his own life to save mine. He missed a job interview, missed opportunities, missed the flight that was supposed to change his life. She looked directly at David. What he didn't miss was the chance to show us all what real leadership looks like. Not the kind that comes from a corner office or a boardroom, but the kind that kneels on a dirty floor to hold a stranger's hand. Margaret turned back to the crowd. Today I'm announcing that the David Miller Community Outreach Model will be piloted in 12 cities across the Pacific Northwest. We're partnering with regional airlines, healthcare systems, and local businesses to create a network of support that transcends traditional boundaries. The announcement drew gasps and enthusiastic applause. David stared at Margaret in shock. She hadn't told him about the expansion or, more significantly, about the program bearing his name. Furthermore, Margaret continued, David has accepted the position of Regional Director for Community Health Initiatives, a role that will allow him to train and mentor program coordinators in each new location. As the crowd erupted in celebration, David felt Rachel's hand slip into his. She squeezed gently, and when he looked down at her, she mouthed the words, I'm so proud of you. His eyes stung with unshed tears. This was not a moment of corporate triumph. This was the moment his sacrifice was not just rewarded but sanctified. He had lost a flight, and in doing so, he had found his true destination. The last notes of the applause died down, leaving a warm, buzzing silence in the courtyard. The crowd, a living tapestry of success and redemption, began to disperse, people shaking hands and exchanging heartfelt goodbyes. David stood on the stage, a dazed smile on his face, the weight of Margaret's announcement still settling over him. The program, his life's work, was not just a success. It was now a legacy, a model that would carry his name and his philosophy far beyond the confines of their city. The banner behind them, its message clear and bold, seemed to hum with a quiet power. People before profit, Monarch Air Community Initiative David Miller, Model Program. Later, as the afternoon sun slanted low across the courtyard, painting the glass facade of Monarch Air headquarters in hues of gold and amber, David found himself standing alone with Margaret near the banner. Rachel had gone to speak with Carmen and Eddie, her face alight with a joy that David had not seen in years. The air was cool and peaceful, a stark contrast to the turbulent storm of his past. You know, Margaret said quietly, her voice a low, thoughtful hum, I never did ask you what you would have said in that interview you missed. What was your answer going to be when they asked why you wanted to work for Monarch Air? David thought for a moment. He remembered the desperate, rehearsed words he had planned to say, the promises he had made to himself and Rachel. They felt small and distant now, like echoes from a different lifetime. He smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. I was going to tell them that I believed airlines could be more than transportation companies, that they could be community partners, helping people not just reach their destinations, but build better lives when they get there. Margaret laughed, a sound full of genuine delight. And now, she asked, a gentle prompt. David looked out over the courtyard where families were still mingling, where new friendships were forming between people who had found hope in unexpected places. He saw a young mother who just a month ago had been on the verge of losing her home, now talking animatedly with a doctor about a health plan for her child. He saw an elderly man once too proud to accept help, now sharing a story and a laugh with one of his own new volunteers. The scene was a living testament to the very philosophy he had wanted to articulate. Now, David said, his voice filled with a profound and quiet certainty, I'd say that sometimes the most important journeys aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones that begin when we choose to stop running toward our own goals long enough to help someone else reach theirs. The banner behind them fluttered in the evening breeze, its message clear and bold. David felt Rachel's hand slip into his. She squeezed gently her thumb, stroking the back of his hand, a familiar gesture that spoke of a love that had endured and deepened through their trials. He looked at her. Truly, looked at her. Her face was no longer pale, her eyes were no longer shadowed with fear, and her breathing was a soft, steady rhythm that was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. They were no longer defined by their struggle, but by their purpose. The debt, the exhaustion, the fear, it was all in the past. What remained was their love, his calling, and the legacy of a kindness that had created a ripple effect he could never have imagined. He had lost his flight, but in doing so he had found his wings. He had given up a job, and in return he had been given a life that was rich with meaning and fulfillment. He was not a man who had failed. He was a man who had chosen a different path, a better one. And in that moment, David Miller knew that sometimes the best destinations are the ones you never plan to reach. Sometimes the flight you miss carries you exactly where you were meant to be. The journey of 1,000 steps had begun, not with a single forward motion, but with a single compassionate decision to stand still. He had made a promise to his wife, and though the path had been different than he had ever imagined, he had kept it. He had not failed her. He had succeeded in a way that was far beyond the confines of a corporate job, a plane ticket, or a city. He had succeeded in being the man she had always believed him to be. And that was all that ever truly mattered.